When the courtroom doors closed behind the jury and the gavel struck for the final recess, the entire town felt as though it was holding its breath, because after months of chaos, depositions, undercover operations, and media swarms parked outside of what used to be a quiet suburban neighborhood, the trial of Karen Whitfield, once the feared and dictatorial HOA president who believed no rule or law could ever restrain her, had reached its climax. And I sat on the wooden bench near the front, watching the postal inspector, Thomas Briggs, who had gone from a quiet federal investigator to a local hero overnight, stand tall with his arms folded, his eyes fixed on the jurors who filed back in with expressions that would define whether Karen's empire of intimidation would collapse or somehow claw its way into a new life. Yet, even as the prosecutor adjusted his tie and the judge prepared her final instructions, I couldn't help but reflect on how far this journey had spiraled beyond the simple crime of stolen mail. Because what began as a few missing envelopes had uncovered forged ballots, identity theft, embezzled HOA funds, and a network of petty tyrants who thought they could bully homeowners into submission with fines, liens, and fabricated violations. And I remembered the nights when I sat at my kitchen table staring at the evidence folders. The photographs of Karen sneaking out at dawn with bundles of neighbors' mail clutched under her arm. The recordings of her brazenly bragging in hushed tones at HOA meetings about how she controlled information. And how Thomas had explained to me, in his calm, measured voice, that this wasn't just about mail theft, it was about civil rights. Federal law, and proving that no one, no matter how high they sat on a neighborhood board, was above accountability. And now here we were, with Karen seated at the defense table, her once meticulously styled hair frayed, her expression a mix of defiance and dread. As her attorney whispered frantically in her ear, perhaps still hoping for a miracle technicality, to free her, though everyone knew by now that her time of unchecked rule had run out because the sting operation had been too clean, too well documented, and too widely witnessed for anyone to doubt. And as the foreperson of the jury stood, holding the folded verdict slip, the silence was so intense that even the sound of the ceiling fans clicking overhead felt deafening. And then, in a voice clear and unwavering, the words "guilty on all counts" rang out, sending a ripple of gasps, murmurs, and suppressed cheers through the gallery. Because justice had finally been carved into stone, and Karen, who had once walked the neighborhood with the arrogance of a monarch, was now trembling in her seat as the bailiff stepped closer, ready to escort her into custody until sentencing. And it was then that the true chaos erupted, because Karen, instead of accepting her fate with whatever shred of dignity she had left, suddenly leapt to her feet, shouting that this was all a conspiracy, that the HOA had been her rightful kingdom. The federal government had framed her because they feared her leadership. And in one shocking motion, she overturned her chair, tried to bolt toward the exit, and collided with two deputies who wrestled her to the ground, handcuffing her as the judge's gavel thundered repeatedly for order. And cameras from every major network captured the meltdown live, cementing Karen's downfall not just as a legal defeat but as a public spectacle, the final unraveling of a woman who believed herself untouchable. Yet even as the courtroom emptied and the neighborhood's residents began to feel the first breaths of freedom from years of her tyranny, a strange unease lingered, because whispers started spreading that Karen hadn't acted entirely alone, that she had allies both in the HOA boardroom and in local politics who had quietly enabled her schemes, people who had benefited from the stolen identities, the misdirected checks, the falsified fines, and the inflated dues. And while Karen had fallen, the machine she helped build was still humming in the shadows, waiting for its chance to strike back. And in the weeks that followed, as Karen was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for mail theft, wire fraud, and racketeering, Inspector Briggs uncovered additional ledgers in her storage unit, files that linked several prominent developers, and even a city council member, 2 kickbacks tied to HOA funds. Proving that Karen had been more than a petty thief, she had been the visible tip of a far larger criminal iceberg. And though justice had clipped her wings, the investigation had only just begun. Because Briggs warned me over coffee one morning that while Karen would serve her time, the people who had propped her up would likely retaliate against anyone who had helped bring her down, meaning I now carried a target on my back. Not just as the homeowner who stood up against the HOA, but as the whistleblower, whose testimony helped dismantle their queen. Yet strangely, instead of fear, I felt a deep resolve, because for the first time in years the neighborhood was alive with hope. Children played without fear of being fined for leaving bikes in driveways, gardens bloomed freely without citation, slips appearing in mailboxes, and neighbors gathered at block parties to celebrate the end of Karen's reign, though always with an eye toward the horizon, knowing that power vacuums rarely stay empty for long, and that someone, somewhere, was plotting to reclaim what had been lost. But as I stood on my porch one evening, sipping coffee while the sun set behind the quiet houses, I promised myself and everyone around me that we would never again allow one woman, one HOA, or one corrupt alliance to control our lives through fear. Because Karen's story, now immortalized in headlines and documentaries, would forever remind us of the price of complacency and the power of resistance. And though Section 6 of this saga ended with her in chains, the true battle, the eternal one, between freedom and control, justice and corruption was only beginning, and this time we were ready. The courtroom was packed, the kind of packed where even the creak of a wooden bench or the shuffle of a suit against fabric seemed amplified by the silence of anticipation. And as the bailiff called the session to order, Karen sat in the defendant's chair with her lips pursed tightly and her arms crossed like a child being told she couldn't have her way. While across the room, the Postal Inspector, Officer Davis, stood tall, holding the files and evidence that would lay bare every ugly deed she had committed. And I, sitting in the gallery, felt the weight of the months-long battle come full circle. As I watched her eyes dart nervously toward the exit, as if she was calculating some final escape, but there was none left, not after the sting operation, not after the cameras caught her red-handed, and certainly not after the neighbors she had terrorized for years decided they would no longer cower, but instead testify. And when the prosecutors began to speak, weaving together the story of her greed, her obsession with control, and her blatant disregard for federal law, the jury leaned forward, their expressions tightening with each revelation. The intercepted packages, the checks she had stolen, the medicine withheld from an elderly veteran, the letters from children she had thrown away without care. Every action painting her not as a misunderstood HOA leader, but as the embodiment of corruption hiding behind rules and bylaws she herself never followed. And as the evidence was displayed on the screen footage from the sting, her fingerprints on stolen envelopes, the recordings of her boasting to a confidant that she was untouchable, the whispers in the courtroom grew louder. The neighbors, exchanging looks of both vindication and disbelief that someone could fall so far from grace, while convincing themselves for so long they were above consequence. And when Karen's attorney attempted to spin her behavior as a misguided attempt at community protection, the prosecutor struck back with cold precision, reminding the jury that federal mail laws are among the most sacred protections in America, tied to trust, privacy, and the very backbone of communication.
Ow.
And Karen had trampled on that with arrogance. And when the time came for witnesses, I was called. And my legs felt like stone as I walked to the stand, but I lifted my chin, locked eyes with the jury, and told them everything. Not just about the missing mail, but about the intimidation, the threats, the nights I felt unsafe in my own home because of her harassment, the way she weaponized the HOA to silence anyone who dared to question her authority. And as I spoke, I saw nods of recognition from others in the room who had lived under her reign of fear, their courage building as one by one more neighbors took the stand, until the weight of testimony became unbearable for her defense to counter. And though Karen tried to feign indifference, her mask cracked when Officer Davis presented the sting operation in vivid detail. The decoy package with a tracker, the cameras hidden in the mailbox, the exact moment she slipped it under her coat and smirked.
Outerwear.
She had just sealed her fate, and when the video played, the gasp that rippled through the room was followed by Karen's shoulders slumping, her bravado evaporating into something smaller, weaker. A person finally realizing the walls had closed in. And as the trial drew to a close, the prosecutor's final words lingered in the air. No one, no matter their title or position, is above the law, and the jury deliberated only a short time before returning with a unanimous verdict, guilty on all counts. And the judge, stern and unwavering, delivered a sentence that echoed through the chamber like a gavel-striking stone: years in federal prison, restitution to the victims, and permanent removal from any position of authority within the HOA. And, as she was led away in handcuffs, her glare shot toward me one last time. A flicker of the Karen who once believed she could bend anyone to her will. But that look was powerless now, stripped of its venom. Because justice had been served and the community, for the first time in years, could breathe freely. What followed was a transformation no one had anticipated. Neighbors who once avoided each other began gathering again. Mailboxes became symbols of trust instead of fear. Children played without anxious parents glancing over shoulders, and Officer Davis, though moving on to his next assignment, left us with a legacy of courage, showing that even against corruption, hiding behind the mask of community service, the truth always finds its way to the surface. And as for me, I walked home from the courthouse that evening, the sun setting in hues of gold and crimson, thinking about how a stolen letter had spiraled into a battle for dignity, how one woman's arrogance had nearly broken an entire neighborhood, and how resilience and accountability restored it. When I reached my mailbox, I opened it slowly, almost reverently, and inside, among the usual bills and flyers, was a simple letter from my sister written weeks ago, but delayed by the chaos Karen had caused. And as I unfolded it and read her words of encouragement, telling me to stay strong, and reminding me that the truth always wins, I smiled, because in that moment, I knew the story was complete. The arc had closed, and the chapter of Karen's tyranny was nothing more than a cautionary tale. A reminder that power abused will always collapse under its own weight, and though scars remained, they were scars of strength, etched into the memory of a community that had endured, resisted, and ultimately triumphed. And that night, as the quiet hum of crickets filled the air and the stars began to pierce the velvet sky, I whispered a silent thank you to Officer Davis, to my neighbors, and to the unbreakable spirit of justice. Knowing deep down that this was not just the end of Karen's reign, but the beginning of a community finally free to write its own future, together, unafraid, and unbroken. In the days that followed Karen's shocking public arrest by the postal inspector, the entire neighborhood buzzed with whispers, rumors, and hushed conversations that carried through cul-de-sacs and over neatly trimmed hedges. For the seemingly invincible HOA president who once lorded over every fence height and mailbox color had been handcuffed in broad daylight. Yet the ripples of that moment had not fully reached the shoreline. Because as it turned out, Karen's arrest was only the beginning of an unraveling saga that would plunge the entire neighborhood into chaos. Fear and a reckoning that no one had expected, least of all her loyal cronies who had once worshipped her power. For though many had celebrated that first victory, there remained the lingering unease of unanswered questions. How long had she been stealing mail? Why was she doing it? And perhaps most chilling of all, was she acting alone, or was there a deeper network of HOA corruption working in tandem to control not only homes, but the very lives of those who lived within the manicured confines of their supposedly peaceful community? And it was in that silence after the spectacle that the postal inspector, whose name was revealed to be Agent Mark Duval, began to dig deeper, finding inconsistencies in the ledgers. Strange bank deposits that didn't line up with Karen's modest salary as HOA president, and a string of suspicious complaints that had been buried or dismissed over the years, all tied together by one thing: missing letters, misplaced bills, and vanishing packages that were more than simple theft. They pointed to a calculated pattern of manipulation, intimidation, and surveillance. A scheme so outrageous that even seasoned investigators struggled to comprehend its scope. Meanwhile, the community itself was torn between relief and dread, for every new revelation felt like a door creaking open to a darker truth. And neighbors who once feared Karen's wrath now feared what would be uncovered if the investigation reached their own mailboxes, because secrets had a way of hiding in plain sight, wrapped inside envelopes never delivered. And in this neighborhood, secrets were currency, traded quietly behind smiles and block party handshakes. It was during one of these tense evenings that David, the homeowner who had first sounded the alarm about Karen's meddling with his mail, sat on his porch, replaying the events over and over in his mind, feeling both vindicated and unsettled, because while he had fought her tyranny, he now realized he had only peeled back one layer of a much larger conspiracy, and as dusk settled over the cul-de-sac, a black sedan rolled slowly past his house, its tinted windows concealing the occupants, a subtle reminder that though Karen was gone, the forces she had served or protected might still be watching. And that's when David received the anonymous note slipped under his front door. She wasn't working alone. Watch your back. The words sent a chill down his spine, yet they also ignited a flame of determination. Because now it wasn't only about personal revenge or HOA injustice, it was about protecting his community, his family, and his right to live without fear of hidden powers manipulating every move. So he contacted Agent Duval again, this time sharing the note and his growing suspicion that Karen's arrest was merely the opening act of something larger. And to his grim satisfaction, Duval confirmed that the evidence pointed in that same direction. 4 more names were surfacing in the investigation board members who had turned a blind eye. A treasurer whose books never quite balanced, and even whispers of local officials being paid off to ignore complaints. And so Section 4 of this story unfolds with the neighborhood, transforming from a place of suburban comfort into a battlefield of hidden alliances, where the homeowners began to splinter into factions, those who wanted to bury the scandal for fear of property values dropping, and those who wanted justice no matter the cost, with David caught in the middle as both a whistleblower and a target. For the deeper he went into the mystery, the more resistance he faced. From threatening phone calls in the night to a brick through his window with a note that read, "Stop digging, or you'll end up like Karen." Yet ironically, the more they tried to silence him, the more resolute he became, because now the community's trust was at stake. And in his heart, David knew this wasn't only his fight, but a battle for everyone who had ever been silenced, bullied or wronged by those hiding behind HOA bylaws and faux authority. And as Agent Duval launched sting operations against other corrupt figures, secretly wiring meetings and tracking financial trails, the tension reached a fever pitch. Neighbors spying on neighbors, alliances fracturing, and the idyllic facade of their perfect neighborhood collapsing into a theater of suspicion. Till one night, under cover of darkness, the inspector, David, and a few trusted residents gathered. In David's garage, maps and documents spread across the hood of his truck, strategizing how to expose the rest of the ring. With the weight of an entire community pressing down on their shoulders, for they were about to uncover not only Karen's crimes, but a sprawling web of deceit that tied the HOA to a larger racket involving mail fraud, real estate manipulation, and the systematic silencing of dissenters. A revelation so shocking that when it finally broke, it would rock the county to its core. But until that moment arrived, fear lingered like a storm cloud, because somewhere out there, someone still loyal to Karen's cause was watching, waiting, and ready to strike against anyone who dared to unravel the empire she had built. And so, with each tick of the clock, danger crept closer, setting the stage for the final confrontation that would decide whether the neighborhood reclaimed its freedom or fell deeper into the shadows of corruption. The days following the decision to set up a sting against Karen were some of the most intense I had ever lived through, because for the first time in this long and exhausting battle with the HOA, it felt like justice was no longer just a distant dream but an imminent reality, and the postal inspector's presence in my life became almost like a shield of authority that I had been longing for since Karen had first tampered with my mailbox. Inspector Alvarez was sharp, methodical, and utterly calm. And he made it clear from the start that while this sting had to look natural and convincing, it also needed to be airtight, because Karen had a habit of twisting situations in her favor. And the moment she sensed she was being trapped, she would try to leverage the HOA, the neighborhood gossip network, and even the local police to spin the narrative into her victimhood. So everything had to be done with precision. Alvarez spent hours with me at my kitchen table, drawing sketches of the neighborhood, asking questions about Karen's daily routines, the paths she usually took on her so-called inspection walks, and exactly when and how she tended to linger near my property, especially around the mailbox, and it shocked me how accurate his instincts were. Because when I described how she often slowed down around noon, pretending to fix a crooked flower pot by the HOA notice board across from my house, Alvarez immediately said, "That's her window? That's when she'll strike." It's a ritual, and ritual behavior is exactly what makes offenders like her predictable. We then discussed bait mail, carefully designed envelopes that looked official but carried tracking technology that would immediately alert his team the moment Karen's fingers touched them. And as he pulled out the small transmitter hidden in what looked like a regular letter, I felt a chill run down my spine. Realizing just how serious this was, Karen wasn't just stealing neighborhood mail as some petty pastime. She was committing a federal offense that could land her in prison, and the government was about to prove it beyond any doubt. The plan was simple in theory, but nerve-wracking in execution. Alvarez would deposit a decoy envelope into my mailbox, one addressed from the IRS with the kind of wording that would pique Karen's greed or curiosity, and then he and his surveillance team would position themselves at strategic spots, one unmarked van at the far end of the cul-de-sac, another plain sedan across from the HOA clubhouse, and a third agent disguised as a jogger with earbuds circling the block, all of them ready to catch her in the act. My role was equally important, though, because I had to play the oblivious resident, the man who had finally stopped complaining, as though Karen's harassment had broken me. I had to maintain that illusion long enough for her to let down her guard and believe the mailbox was hers to plunder again. Those next 48 hours stretched into an eternity, every creak of the floorboards in my house reminding me of Karen's footsteps outside, every rustle of leaves sounding like her nosy breath hovering near my windows. And when the morning of the sting finally arrived, I barely touched my breakfast because my stomach was tied in knots of anticipation. Alvarez arrived early, disguised in plain clothes as a contractor checking the community's sprinkler system, and he gave me a firm nod before slipping the bait envelope into my mailbox with gloved hands. The letters IRS stamped clearly across the corner, an official seal shining just enough to look tempting. I watched from behind my curtains as Karen emerged from her house across the street, carrying her clipboard like a weapon, her oversized sunglasses covering eyes I knew were scanning the street for her next excuse to assert dominance, and my heart hammered against my chest as she strolled casually toward the HOA notice board, pausing to straighten a flyer about upcoming lawn inspections, her gaze flicking again and again to my mailbox. She lingered longer than usual, almost as if she could feel the trap that was waiting for her. But then, like a moth to flame, she drifted closer, her hand pretending to brush against the flowers by the curb before her fingers slid onto the mailbox lid, and in that frozen second, I felt the world hold its breath, because this was it. The moment everything we had built toward was about to collapse or explode into justice. The lid creaked open, her hand dipped inside, and she slipped the envelope out, holding it delicately as though she had just plucked a prize she had earned. And she tucked it into her clipboard so smoothly it was clear this wasn't her first time. I glanced toward Alvarez's van in the distance and saw his hand tighten on a radio, his lips moving into the command that would set everything in motion. But Karen, oblivious to the storm gathering around her, turned on her heels and began her slow, arrogant walk back toward the HOA office, humming to herself as if mocking the very laws she was breaking. Within seconds, the disguised jogger broke stride and angled toward her. The sedan pulled out from its spot across the clubhouse, and Alvarez himself emerged, flashing his badge so fast and loud that Karen froze, the smugness draining from her face like color from a washed-out painting. And though she tried to spin, to stutter, to claim she was merely securing suspicious mail, Alvarez's voice cut through the air like thunder. "Ma'am, you are under arrest for federal mail. Theft." Neighbors peeked from blinds, whispers turning into a chorus of gasps, as Karen was handcuffed on the very street where she had lorded her power for years, her cries of, "This is harassment. I'm the HOA president," falling flat against the undeniable evidence in Alvarez's gloved hands, the bait letter now marked with her fingerprints and sealed with her guilt. I stood at my window in stunned silence, torn between triumph and disbelief. Because the dragon that had tormented me and half the neighborhood had finally been chained. And as the postal inspector's van rolled away with Karen shouting empty, threats about lawyers and revenge, a strange quiet settled over the street. A quiet that felt like the first true breath of freedom I had inhaled in months, yet beneath that quiet was a new tension. Because while Karen was gone, her loyalists in the HOA still lingered, and I knew deep down that this war wasn't over. In fact, the real fallout was only just beginning. The following week unfolded like something out of a crime thriller, because once the postal inspector, a tall no-nonsense man named Agent Reynolds, took my notes and listened to my account. He leaned back in his chair with that calm, assessing look that told me he'd seen this kind of neighborhood madness before. But what he said next both rattled me and electrified me. If she's stealing mail, we're going to have to catch her in the act, and for that, we'll need your help. And in that moment, I realized I was about to step into the middle of a federal sting operation. It's the kind of thing I'd only seen in movies, except this wasn't fiction, and the target wasn't some faceless criminal, it was Karen from down the street, the same woman who wrote me nasty HOA violation slips for leaving my garbage cans out too long. And Reynolds explained that the plan was deceptively simple, but surgically precise. Because they were going to prepare a set of bait mail addressed to me, laced with tiny surveillance devices and marked bills. And I would casually place the mail in my own box as if it had just been delivered, then wait and watch as the trap was set. And I remember walking out of that federal office both nervous and exhilarated. Because part of me feared Karen would sense the setup and turn the entire HOA against me before it went down. But the other part of me relished the idea of finally wiping that smug grin off her face when the inspectors swarmed her. Because everyone in the neighborhood whispered about her tyranny, but no one had the courage to stand up until now. Sure enough, when Reynolds and 2 other inspectors rolled up in an unmarked sedan a few days later, dressed like regular delivery workers, my pulse raced because I knew the game had begun, and I played my role carefully. Standing by my driveway, as they delivered a small stack of envelopes, one of which contained a hidden tracker smaller than a fingernail, another of which carried dust-like forensic powder, invisible to the naked eye, but unmistakable under ultraviolet light. And as soon as they were in my mailbox, I walked back inside with the blinds tilted just enough for me to see everything without, drawing suspicion, my heart pounding like I was the one committing the crime. And the waiting was torture because Karen didn't come by that morning or the next, and I began to wonder if maybe she had caught on. But then on the 3rd day, just past noon, I heard the faint shuffle of footsteps and the yappy bark of her dog outside. And through the slats of the blinds I saw Karen in her oversized sun hat and floral blouse, feigning a casual stroll, pausing by my mailbox like she was checking her shoe, then glancing over her shoulder before her hand darted out and opened it. And the sight of her fingers rifling through my letters sent a surge of adrenaline through me, because this was it. This was the moment of truth, and as she plucked the envelopes out and slid them under her clipboard, I had to bite my lip not to laugh, because I knew she had just doomed herself. The inspectors knew it too, because hidden down the block in their sedan, they were watching the tracker light up on their monitor. The tiny blinking dot that confirmed Karen had taken bait mail from a federal mailbox. And I'll never forget the irony of it, how she strutted off down the sidewalk like she was still queen of the neighborhood, completely unaware that she was walking into the jaws of a federal case because Reynolds and his team weren't about to move yet. No, they wanted her caught with the evidence in her possession, ideally opening the mail, which would escalate the charges. And so the dance continued over the next 48 hours, with Karen stealing 2 more pieces of bait mail from my box, and even daring to peek into Lopez's and Patel's as if she owned the entire row of mailboxes. And every time the inspectors documented her movements, the timestamps, the tracker pings, the fingerprints lifted from the envelopes, building a case so airtight that no slick lawyer could wriggle her out of it. And yet the tension on my end was unbearable, because I still had to play dumb, nodding at her during HOA patrols as she smirked, even enduring her little barbs at the next board meeting where she said in front of everyone that some people clearly don't get their bills on time, a comment so loaded with malice it made me grip my chair to stop myself from shouting back. But I held my tongue because I knew what she didn't. Her empire was crumbling. And soon the entire neighborhood would see her for what she really was. Not a queen bee, not an enforcer of order, but a thief caught red-handed by federal agents. And that night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I realized something that both sobered me and strengthened my resolve. The inspectors weren't just trying to stop her. They were relying on me to stand firm, to keep playing my role until the final strike, because the bait was set, the trap was closing. And soon Karen would discover the hard way that tampering with the mail doesn't just make you a nosy HOA tyrant, makes you a felon. The trouble began with something so small, so ordinary, so seemingly insignificant, that at first I brushed it off as a fluke. Yet little did I know that the missing envelopes in my mailbox would snowball into a chain of events that would not only expose the darkest, pettiest side of my neighborhood's HOA, but also bring federal inspectors, hidden cameras, and handcuffs to the pristine cul-de-sac that everyone once thought was the safest place to live. Because when the mail started disappearing, I thought maybe it was kids being mischievous, or maybe the wind had carried a letter away, or maybe even the post office made a mistake. But as the days went on, and the bills, the bank statements, and even a package I was waiting on vanished into thin air, the uneasy feeling in my stomach told me something was very wrong. And when I began asking around the neighborhood, I realized I wasn't the only one. Because Mrs. Lopez 2 doors down complained about her Amazon box being torn open before she got to it. Mr. Patel at the corner said his insurance papers never showed up. And yet no one wanted to make a big deal of it until the whispers began. Pointing in one direction award, the HOA president herself, a woman everyone mockingly yet fearfully referred to as Karen, a sharp-tongued, self-important middle-aged woman who strutted around with a clipboard as if she were the sheriff of the block, policing lawns, issuing fines, and gossiping about anyone who dared to question her authority. And at first the idea that she could be stealing people's mail seemed absurd, because who in their right mind would risk a federal crime just to snoop? But then the pieces began to fit when I noticed that every time something important of mine went missing, Karen mysteriously had information she shouldn't have. Like when she chastised me at the HOA meeting for being behind on utilities, even though I had just mailed my check, and only the company and I should have known about it. Or when she smirked at Mrs. Lopez about ordering cheap clothes from China, the exact day Mrs. Lopez's package had disappeared. And it dawned on me that Karen wasn't just a nosy neighbor. She had been secretly raiding mailboxes to get dirt on us, to feed her sense of control, to make herself the queen bee of the HOA. And while the others in the neighborhood grumbled and gossiped, I knew this wasn't just about privacy or petty harassment anymore. This was a federal offense, and the more I thought about it, the angrier I became, because people's identities could be stolen, finances ruined, and lives wrecked over the information that sat in our letters. And yet Karen smirked around as if nothing could touch her, as if the HOA board was her shield, as if she could keep us cowed and silent forever. But I wasn't about to let it go, not this time. Not when she crossed a line that no one should cross. So I began documenting everything: the missing mail, dates, the suspicious comments, even the times I saw Karen walking her little white dog near my box when she had no reason to be there. And when I finally had enough, I reached out to someone who could handle it: the U.S. Postal Inspection Service, one of the oldest federal law enforcement agencies in America, the people who investigate mail fraud, theft, and every crime tied to the postal system. And when I got on the phone with the local inspector and explained the situation, I could hear the spark of interest in his voice turn into steel-edged seriousness as he asked me to come down to the office, bring my notes, and prepare to cooperate in something bigger than I'd ever imagined, because he told me point blank, mail theft is no joke. It's a federal crime punishable by up to 5 years in prison. If your HOA president is involved, we'll catch her red-handed.